thinking, what on earth am I going to say? Because if you haven't worked out yet that he's the president of the society, then there's something really wrong. And you probably also know about the day job, which he also has. He's the professor at Leeds. He's a very eminent academic who won one of the prizes at the BSHS for his fantastic work, Brazilian Tom. If you were here yesterday, you would have heard Graham telling you that he's been working on Mendel and also on intellectual property. So I have been slightly concerned all day about what I was going to tell you about Greg that you didn't already know. But at tea time, Jim Moore solved my problem for me because he gave me this, which is this week's edition of the TLS. And the only name, well, there's two names on the front cover. One is Darwin, which I'm very interested in him, and the other is Gregory Radick. And the whole, did you know this? That the whole lead article, the first article, the big article in it, is by Greg and is about a book called Political Dissent, Marvelous Mutualism and the Politics of Evolution in Victorian England. So I'll leave you to read that at your leisure later, because in the meantime, we've got the pleasure of listening to Greg talking about experimenting with the scientific past. Thank you, Greg.
Wow, thank you, Patricia. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming. I know this comes at the end of a long day. It's been stimulating and fulfilling, but still, you've had wall-to-wall history of science, and still you're here, which makes you my kind of people. So thanks so much for coming. When I realized that I'd be giving my presidential address in this year, in this place, in 2015 in Swansea, I was doubly delighted. And I'm going to explain at the very end why Swansea is special for me for these purposes. But let me mention 2015 first of all. This year marks 150 years from the time when Gregor Mendel, in February and March 1865, gave the two lectures on experiments that he'd been doing in the monastery gardens in Brunn. Experiments that were published the next year in the Proceedings of the Brunn Natural Sciences Society under the title Experiments in Plant Hybridization. And we now look back on that, of course, as the foundation statement for the science of genetics. Now, I appreciate that anniversaries aren't special to everybody. Notoriously, in 1998, the BMJ tried to ban them, announcing to readers that we promise no more boring anniversaries. After an orgy of anniversaries in 1998, and with the prospect of the mother of all anniversaries causing civilization to grind to a halt in 2000, the BMJ is declaring 1999 an almost anniversary-free year. Because of popular demand, Christmas will be maintained. Please do not contact us about the anniversary of your favorite institution, invention, or person, and we won't call you. And yet, still, people celebrate anniversaries. And they matter. Historians of science particularly appreciate how much these kinds of commemorative occasions can leave legacies. I've persuaded myself, at least, though I won't go into the details today, that the last Mendel anniversary, which took place in 1965-1966, at the height of the Cold War, in the aftermath of the Lysenkoist period, is the reason why so many people who know little else about Mendel think they know that there might be something fishy, even fraudulent, about his data. So anniversaries can be potent, whether or not we approve of them. This year, there have already been Mendel anniversary occasions. There are more to come. I'll be involved in 3 of them before it's all over with. And I think it's worth asking, well, what, if anything, have we got to contribute? Or at least in this case, what have I got to contribute? I've been working for a number of years less directly on Mendel than on the debate that broke out in the early years of the 20th century after his work was, quote-unquote, rediscovered. And the focus of my energies and the center of the debate in the early 20th century was between these two men, Walter Frank Raphael Weldon and William Bateson. Weldon born in 1860, Bateson in 1861. They got to know each other initially at Cambridge, where they both studied zoology. They were friendly. been quite close friends for a long period, but there were disagreements and fallings out. All of that in the background to the spring of 1900, when 3 European botanists, apparently independently of one another, rediscovered Mendel's ratios, rediscovered his explanation for the patterns that he'd found in his garden peas, and brought Mendel's name, which was otherwise known only to fellow specialists in pea hybridization, into the biological discussion. Bateson rather rapidly persuaded himself, took about 2 years altogether, but rapidly persuaded himself that Mendel's work was fundamentally important and deserved to be the foundation for a new quantitative experimental science of heredity, a science that at the time soon became known as Mendelism. Bateson's coinage, genetics, quickly took off as well. Over that same period, Weldon came to more or less the opposite point of view about Mendel's work. And in 1902, so 2 years after the rediscovery, Weldon published a remarkable article on Mendel's paper in which he included this photographic plate. You're looking at peas. Now, you'll recall from school biology, if nothing else, that Mendel worked with binary characters, the color of the seed being either green or yellow, the seed shape being either round or wrinkled. Well, what Weldon found was that nobody else's peas looked like that. If you have a look, just for our purposes today, at the top row there, we see in cell 1 green peas, and cell 6 yellow peas, but along the way we get varying shades of greeny yellow to yellowy green. We get all of the colors in the spectrum mixed in a continuum. For purposes today, I'm going to boil down the point of view in that paper and others that Weldon published into 3 dicta and an upshot. Dictum number 1, variation matters. It matters that real peas aren't just green or yellow, aren't just round or wrinkled. The variability is something that might itself hold a clue to how inheritance works, and a science of inheritance that deliberately disguises the variability, encourages the forgetting of it, is one that's moving in the right direction, so Weldon thought. Second dictum, and these are all related, ancestry matters. The particular ancestry, the particular lineage that those peas come from can matter. Again, Mendelism encourages ignorance and incuriosity about the deep ancestry behind any particular individual. As long as your true breeding green-seeded peas are producing green-seeded peas, that's all you need to know about them. Weldon thought that was a mistake, and he thought it was connected to the indifference to all of that variability. Behind all of that variability lay different kinds of ancestry. And ancestry matters because what is inherited is not just individual factors for, but a context. Third dictum, environment matters. Within a lineage, one inherits not just this or that factor for, but a whole range of factors for. But more than that, internal environments from the womb right on through. We ought to have a biology, Weldon thought, which takes seriously the way that environments, internal and external, condition the visible effects of what is inherited. And here's the upshot for Weldon. The Mendelian picture of quote-unquote dominance as absolute. So, for example, yellowness as dominant to greenness, full stop across the board, no matter the context, is at best deeply misleading. In Weldon's view, when you run a Mendelian experiment, what you do is deliberately to exclude all of the variability that would otherwise give you different kinds of pattern. If you were so minded, Weldon thought, you could probably getting a race of peas going in which greenness was dominant to yellowness. It all depends on the choices you make, the context that you build. And to declare one natural and the other as unnatural is just arbitrary. We need a concept of dominance which is contextual. So that's early 1902. A vigorous critique of Mendel's paper. Bateson did not take kindly to it. The gloves came off, and the debate was on. This is what historians now call the biometrician-Mendelian debate. We'll come on to in a moment to why Weldon's side was called the biometricians. But let's look at Bateson first. Bateson proved to be an exceedingly creative, energetic advocate for his position. He was very successful, first of all, at recruiting brilliant allies. You see him sitting here with Reginald Punnett. Again, anyone who's done this kind of work at school has been aided by Punnett squares. It's the kind of thing that successful research programs begin to attract. They begin to attract people like Punnett who begin to innovate in those kinds of ways. He wrote a textbook. Mendel's Principles of Heredity initially carries the subtitle A Defense because it is a reply to Weldon's 1902 paper. This is published in around about June 1902. It goes on, once Bateson reckons correctly that he's won the debate, to lose the subtitle and just become Mendel's Principles of Heredity. But a book for a general audience explaining what's up and why it's of importance. Thirdly, Bateson recruits among those excellent students ones who are dedicated to vindicating Mendelism as useful for breeders. Bateson, as he takes himself around to breeders' conferences, tells them that with Mendelism, they will soon have the powers over breeds that chemists have over compounds. Because of the atomic theory, chemists are able at will to plug qualities in and out of compounds. Likewise, Bateson promises, in 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, breeders too will be able to plug inherited qualities in and out. That's the power of Mendelian thinking. And again, he acquired talented students like Roland Biffin, principally, but others as well, who took it as their mission to realize this vision, and to a large extent, they managed it. What was Weldon doing during this time? Weldon was different. Bateson was based at Cambridge. He worked extensively with the women of Newnham's College in developing the Mendelian program. Weldon was based at Oxford, where he was professor of comparative zoology. He had students around him too, but he doesn't seem to have created anything like the same kind of a group. And from 1904 to 1905, he launched himself instead on writing his what was to be his statement, his alternative vision for a science of inheritance. It was labeled Theory of Inheritance, and he didn't live to finish it or publish it. But for a number of years, Annie Jamieson and I'll be talking more about Annie later, have been working on a scholarly edition of the manuscript. So we've got to know it pretty well, and we have a sense of how it goes. Let me just give you a brief taste. It begins with a lesson in statistics. The name biometry was apt because this was a science which was to take statistics as its descriptive language, because only statistics could capture the variability inherent in any biological population. So the book begins with a basic statistics lesson. It then proceeds to contrast Mendel with Francis Galton. In Weldon's view, there were two class acts in inheritance in the 19th century. One was Gregor Mendel, the other was Francis Galton. And the choice between them, rather surprisingly, turns out to be their conceptions of dominance. With Mendel, we get a conception of dominance as absolute. Yellowness is dominant to greenness, no matter what the context. With Galton, we get a concept of dominance as relative, dependent upon the context. That's the choice we face, says Weldon. And how should we choose between them? He says, let's look generally at how dominance works in biology. And at that point, and through the rest of the manuscript, we get a tour up through the animal organizational scale of experimental embryological work through the latter part of the 19th century. All of it on Weldon's interpretation, showing that the properties of a tissue depend fundamentally on what it's interacting with, depending on what is next to what. So the lesson he draws from experiments like this, the slicing of the stentor into 3 parts, each part growing independently into a separate stentor, is that you would never have guessed that those parts had those potentialities if the parts had not been artificially disturbed. When they were adjacent to what they were adjacent, those potentialities were invisible. What's next to what changes everything. And again, he takes this to be a Galtonian message. which for historians of biology is immensely surprising. We remember Francis Galton as Mr. Hereditarian, the person who thought that nature beat nurture across the board. That wasn't remotely Weldon's reading of Galton, and he was probably the most perspicuous reader of Galton there ever was. So Weldon works on this book through 1904 and 1905. He's engaged in what is increasingly a furious, bad-tempered public debate with Bateson. And it only really ends in the spring of 1906 when Weldon, to everyone's surprise, dies. In the immediate instance through pneumonia, a lot of people thought through the stress brought on by this debate. Where do we go from there? Well, it's a success story for Mendelism. There in 1909, a statue of Mendel goes up in the town square in Brunn. William Bateson is there somewhere in the crowd. And as they say, to make a long story short, if we cut ahead to how genetics is taught at universities, including mine, the University of Leeds, we find that students early on, and I attended the lecture course, day 1, lecture 1, are taught about Mendel. Mendel and his peas. And they're walked through the experiments. And in a well-constructed genetics course, the students are introduced by degrees to ever more complex variations on the Mendelian theme. They're given the tools, they're given the problem set at the end of the chapter, and they're pushed to use the tools to extend them in all the ways that we're familiar with from our reading of Kuhn. It can be very brilliant. And such is the place of Mendel in the genetics curriculum that this textbook comes in 2 flavors. iGenetics, a Mendelian approach, and iGenetics, a molecular approach. But they're the same chapters, just in a different order. As soon as in the molecular book you hit organisms, you start with Gregor Mendel in the monastery garden and his peas. So, that's how it happened. But did it have to happen like that? Was it bound to happen that way? Were we bound to have a biology which recognized and enthroned something like the Mendelian gene? Was that inevitable? Or on the contrary, might there have been a success or more success for Weldon had some things or other been different, had circumstances somehow been different, had he perhaps been more successful at recruiting allies, had he lived to finish his book and publish? Might there have been a Weldonian biology just as successful as the Mendelian one became, but with a different kind of a complexion? And does this matter for us at all? So now I come on to my title, Experimenting with the Scientific Past. What I've just given you is a counterfactual fantasy. What didn't happen but might have. And in a sense, that's a kind of experiment. It's a kind of imaginative experiment. In the imagination, or if you don't like the word imagination, conceptually, we remove something from the actual past and reason through the consequences. This has been written about as a phenomenon most recently by the very eminent historian Richard Evans. He refers to these as altered past. You make an alteration in the past, work out the implications. Henry Ford famously said that history is bunk. Richard Evans defends history very ably, but he thinks counterfactual history is bunk. He thinks the only interesting question one can ask is why anyone wants to go there. What kind of a pathology, what kind of interests are being pursued when people ask about not what actually happened, but what might have been. The facts are sufficient, Evans said. Let us concentrate on the facts. We don't need the fantasy. We don't need the fiction. Now, in thinking about experimenting with the scientific past, I go often to Ian Hacking for inspiration and clarification. And I'll be showing you another of his books in a moment. But representing and intervening is a great one for thinking with when you're thinking about experimentation. And I think if Hacking were here, he would encourage a little bit of literal-mindedness. It isn't, of course, literally the case that anyone can experiment with the scientific past. Not in the way that I can experiment with water, for example. Water is accessible to me. I can intervene in water. The scientific past, in a literal sense, is gone. So whatever kind of an experiment that we are doing when we go counterfactual, it's not a literal experiment in that sense. I'm actually going to be talking about a literal experiment, and I think it throws light on the scientific past. But just to be clear, it's not, in the industrial strength sense, an experiment with the scientific past. You might want to say that we're doing thought experiments. Virtual history, as Neil Ferguson calls it, replaying the tape, using a Stephen Jay Gould metaphor. But those are just PR. There's experiments and there are not. Final preliminary thought, and here I was inspired by Martin Rudwick's comments yesterday in talking about his prize-winning book on the emergence of the science that deals with the history of the Earth. That the kind of historical reasoning that we engage with didn't start with people concerned with human history, but with, Martin says, well, Martin actually has a room in his larger story for Pompeii and so forth, but in the version we got yesterday, people concerned with the history of the Earth worked out some of the reasoning behind reconstructing the sequence of past events. And I put Stephen Jay Gould's wonderful life book here by way of reminding us that these questions about what might have been, how inevitable the present regime is, whether we might have had different things, these kinds of debates occur among natural scientists as well as among those of us who study them. And that might be worth reflecting on. So, in a playful way, let me offer my own dicta and an upshot on counterfactuals. The first is that they are pervasive, whether we like it or not, whether we approve of them or not. And that's because explanation is a counterfactual business. There's a philosophical thesis there that I'm not going to defend today. What I want to show you by way of the pervasiveness are some examples. And I'm going to go back to Weldon, first of all. You might be inclined to think it's just kind of nitpicking to point out that peas aren't all either green or yellow, but some are a bit greeny yellow and some a bit yellowy green. I think Weldon was sensitive to that. And in explaining himself to his own students, he went counterfactual with the history of science. This was in 1905 at a lecture that he gave at Oxford. 1904, you might know, the Nobel Prize went to Ramsay and Rayleigh for the discovery of argon. In the 1890s, a whole new column of the periodical table got filled in, the noble gases. Weldon drew a methodological lesson for his students, and he drew it counterfactually. Why do people go counterfactual? They do it when they're probing the past to figure out what mattered, what made the difference, to assess how much of a difference something made. Here's how Weldon did it when telling the story about Ramsay and Rayleigh. The discovery of argon was directly due to a refusal to replace the variable and discordant experience of the weight of nitrogen by an ideal uniformity based on the mean of actual experiences. So the difference in two data sets that they were working with was tiny. Other scientists would have overlooked it, but not the great ones. The great ones understood that the tiniest of differences can be a clue. He goes on, if Lord Rayleigh had replaced all the results in his table by a single compromise between them and had been content to stop there, we should not know the existence of argon today. A fundamental discovery depended on not allowing oneself off the hook with a discrepant datum. On the other hand, Weldon went on, if previous investigators had not been content to replace their experience and that of Cavendish by a compromise which neglected his residual bubble, argon must have been discovered long ago. So a kind of double counterfactual. Within our field, there are distinguished examples of people going some ways in exploring how much of a difference, for example, in James Cushing's case, the Copenhagen interpretation mattered. And doing that by going counterfactual. Imagine a history in which the Bohmian interpretation had dominated instead. What would that look like? Peter Bowler, who I think is here, yeah, right in front of me, has tried to look at what would be the case if Darwin hadn't published The Origin of Species. What would the history of biology and society have looked like? So there are distinguished examples within our own field of pursuing this line of thought. I'm, in the way that all internet chat goes, I'm going to go extreme for a moment to make my point. And I'm going to bring up what is, for historians like me concerned with Darwin, one of the really vexed questions in figuring out how much things mattered. How much of a difference did Darwinism make to what happened in Nazi Germany? A very vexed and complex question. I'm now going to show you what I regard as the single smartest thing that anyone's ever said about it. Here goes. Selectionist social Darwinism, the idea that human society was governed by the struggle, whether between races or between individuals or families, for the survival of the fittest, and the language and concepts which it inserted into welfarist and criminological discourse before the First World War, had a widespread and growing influence in the discussion of social problems at this time. So there we get a standard statement. Something happened. The language and concepts of survival of the fittest permeated welfarist and criminological discourse. So what? Here comes. Without the emergence of this language, Nazi ideology would not have been able to develop as it did. That's a very strong statement. That's saying that Darwinism mattered, and mattered in a profound way. Right? Again, without the emergence of this language, Nazi ideology would not have been able to develop as it did. And he goes on to explain himself. And its spread during the Weimar Republic helped reconcile those who used it, and for whom it had become an almost automatic way of thinking about society, to accept the policies which the Nazis advocated, and in many cases to collaborate willingly in putting them into effect. That's a very strong counterfactual assertion. No Darwinism, nothing like the potency of Nazi ideology as we actually had it. Who is the author of this extraordinary counterfactual conjecture? It's Richard Evans. So Richard Evans, when he's being a mind-bendingly brilliant historian, helps himself to counterfactual language in order to clarify why the past happened in the way that he did. And yet Richard Evans, when he retires to his armchair to reflect on his practice as a historian, regards counterfactualism as bunk. That is something to think about. Second dictum. Counterfactuals can express basic visions and divisions about science. And here we touch on big themes. Themes that Martin touched on yesterday. History, knowledge, reality. Here I owe a debt, as I think those like me interested in this question. I'm delighted that there are more. It used to be all me, but now there's lots. And we all, I think, were stimulated hugely by Ian Hacking's book, The Social Construction of What, published in 1999. And Hacking usefully identified at the bottom of the science wars a serious question about the nature of science. What kind of enterprise science was. And it tended to be cashed out counterfactually. So on the one side, we have the traditional view of how science works, what it is, why we hold it in esteem. And that's tied up with a kind of inevitabilism about science. I want to show you what I mean. I don't think I'm probably the first person in the universe to pair these two. This is Thomas Babington Macaulay, and this is Jeremy Clarkson. Let me tell you about Macaulay, first of all. Macaulay, in the 1820s, in his fabulous essay on the poet John Dryden, says at one point, by way of talking about how cultures develop and the developments we get both in art and science are of their time, he says that if there had been no Copernicus, we would all have been Copernicans. If there had been no Columbus, America would have been found. If there had been no Locke, John Locke, the true theory, the just theory of the mind would have been discovered. Once the time is right, the individual who achieves is a matter of happenstance. It's going to happen. Once all of the elements are in the right relationship. And that's a view that has run, and it wasn't new to Macaulay, and it's just part of the wider culture, not even highfalutin culture, which is why Jeremy Clarkson is up there. That is the pugilist presenter, Jeremy Clarkson, getting an honorary degree in 2003 from Brunel University for services to Brunel, as in Isambard Kingdom, Brunel. What Clarkson had done was on a BBC television program trying to debate who was the greatest Briton, and then there was a public vote, was that Clarkson very ably defended Brunel to such a degree that Brunel, the dark horse, as it were, in the race, became in number 2, just behind Winston Churchill. And at a key moment in the debate, or so I've read, Clarkson was debating Andrew Marr, the slick television presenter who was defending Darwin. And he said this to Marr. He said, the thing about Darwin is that the theory of natural selection would have been found anyway. And in fact, it was by Alfred Russel Wallace, who was honored at a building just around the corner here. So to that extent, he wasn't that great. Whereas Isambard Kingdom Brunel is responsible for bridges and engineering works, ships, which are singularly his. Only that individual would have been responsible for those achievements. And it was a very difficult point to come back from by Marr, because there's a sense in which if you have to say, no, only Darwin could have come up with the theory of natural selection, there's a sense in which somehow that demeans the theory, because surely it's a sign of a true theory that it's out there, and that other investigators will get to it eventually, or so the inevitabilist tradition encourages us to think. When it comes to genetics, here's an early statement of that same sensibility at work. This comes from an article by the Boasian anthropologist Alfred Kroeber. It's less than 15, it's a little bit more than 15 years from the triple rediscovery. Already it's become canonical, the triple rediscovery of Mendel. Here's what Kroeber says. There may be those who see in these pulsing events only a meaningless play of capricious fortuitousness. But there will be others to whom they reveal a glimpse of a great and inspiring inevitability, which rises as far above the accidents of personality as the march of the heavens transcends the wavering contacts of random footprints of clouds on Earth. That's what science is. It transcends the human. That's why we esteem it. Wipe out the perception of De Vries, Correns, and Chermak, the 3 rediscoverers, in 1900, and it is yet clear that before another year had rolled around, the principles of Mendelian heredity would have been proclaimed to an according world, and by 6 rather than 3 discerning minds. So that's the inevitabilist tradition. And it's helpful to know about it and think about it in those terms when one's asking about the great challenger to all of that, social constructionism, with its great emphasis on contingency. Contingency is a threat to those who are threatened by it because it is a counter to inevitability. Here's a statement from a book a lot of you, I'm guessing, will have read and cherish. Chapin and Schaffer, Leviathan and the Air Pump. Early on. We want to show that there was nothing self-evident or inevitable about this series of historical judgments in the context of the Hobbes-Boyle debate, which yielded a natural philosophical consensus in favor of the experimental program. Given other circumstances bearing upon that philosophical community, Hobbes's views might have found a different reception. There was nothing intrinsically flawed in it. Our science now might not esteem the experimental method in the way that it does, had things gone differently back in the 17th century, or so they asserted counterfactually. Forgive the self-advertisement. It's just that this came up at dinner last night in ways that helped me. I was talking with a colleague, and she asked, what is the relationship between the work you're doing on the debate over Mendel and my previous book, which is about the animal language debate? And I initially said, well, nothing really. They're just different kinds of research projects. But that wasn't right, because At heart, this book, too, is an expression of an interest in these questions about knowledge and history and reality. It's a story about an experimental program which is invented in the 1890s to great acclaim, then disappears for decades, and then gets reinvented in a completely different context, but once again to great acclaim in the 1970s. And it's not easy to talk about these questions, but they do attract me, and I think that they matter. And this is probably the most out there bit of my talk, but when I ask myself, why are counterfactuals so pervasive, not just among people who are thoughtful about the sciences, but among people? I suspect that if you were to go through the newspaper one day and actually to itemize all of the counterfactual statements that appear, you'd be quite amazed how much of our discourse is counterfactual. How many of your own thoughts over the course of a day tend this way? And I suppose anthropologically, there's even a case for thinking of us as the counterfactual animal. Serious people have conjectured that the beginnings of language and a distinctively human kind of a mind bring with them an ability to think away from the given, to think about the future, to think about what might have been. A Darwinian account of conscience is very much about reflecting on what you should have done and what you now feel bad about not having done. There we are. Third dictum. The epistemology of counterfactuals is utterly mysterious. Why should it be the case? If we do this all the time, it does seem to matter. Why do we fictionalize in order to get closer to the facts? And how does that work? What kind of knowledge is this? How can we know about what didn't happen, what might have been but didn't? How do we assess certain conjectures as plausible and other conjectures as implausible? And again, I think it's much too quick to declare that this isn't your problem. You do this, I do this, everybody does this. Whewell did it. In Whewell's History of the Inductive Sciences, you will find magnificent counterfactual scenarios. A lot of our knowledge seems to be infected with counterfactualism. And so my upshot. Here again, I borrow from others. We can either debate the possibility of counterfactual history of science, or we can get on with the task of doing it better. Again, we all do it. So what would it be to do it better, to do it more reflectively, more creatively? My own thoughts along these lines have concentrated on those textbooks, the textbook survival of Mendelism, the organization of knowledge, of inheritance as it's built up in the student around a Mendelian core. And the natural thought comes, well, if one's interested in what a Weldonian biology might have looked like, one way to think about it is to ask, well, what would textbooks look like now? If Weldon had managed to make his case better than he had, and if subsequent biologists had accepted that interactionist view of inheritance and environment as a core value, what would they look like? Here is a passage from Weldon's manuscript, which I think could serve as the credo for the textbook that I'm imagining. This is remarkable. This is 1904, 1905. He says, since the character of any organ depends not only upon something inherited, but also on two conditions external to the organ itself, namely its relation to the parts of the body to which it belongs, and its relation to the environment in which that body exists, we may say that every character of every animal is both inherited and acquired. Every character of every animal. It's all nature and nurture together, all the way down and all the way up. So, if you were to set yourself this task of writing a Weldonian curriculum for beginning students in inheritance, what might it look like? Well, you might think in a Weldonian spirit that you begin not with something artificially simple, but with something actual and complicated. Like, for example, the contribution that genes make to the state of your heart. Even if you know nothing about this, you would guess correctly that whatever contribution your genes make, they're going to be just part of a much more complicated story. Because we've got genes, we've got diet, we've got stress, we've got the development of the individual over the course of a lifetime. All of that somehow adding up. What if you were to begin students thinking about that example? And what if throughout the course you were to make primary and hammer home at every possible opportunity that genes only have the effects that they do on bodies in contexts, that the environments matter. Typically in a genetics curriculum, this is a luxury item, which students reach 2/3 of the way through, and it's more or less ignorable. What if that were not the ignorable secondary item, but absolutely primary and pervasive? And what if when students actually met Mendel, they met him not initially as the person whose generalizations should organize everything else, but rather as someone who uncovered some interesting phenomena which are interesting special cases. So that their curiosity is excited by why it should be that sometimes you get these patterns which lend themselves to mathematizing in the way that Mendel did. What would they be like, these students? In particular, what would they be like when it comes to genetic determinism? Would they be a little bit less prone than students coming out of a traditional Mendelian organized course to accept news reports, for example, about the discovery of the latest gene for autism or a gene for schizophrenia? Would they want to ask more questions when being told the results of their own genetic tests? Not just about the genes, but about the genetic background. And ask more questions about how those genetic backgrounds and environments might matter to what those genes are genes for. Mendelism from early on acquired a reputation for being a little simple-minded on this front. From Ted Porter's biography of Carl Pearson, I learned about a diary that Pearson kept during the Great War. And at one point, he records the story of a Mendelian that he crossed swords with before, coming along, and in an exasperated way, he talks about this fellow wondering about whether music in the Welshman was a Mendelian recessive. Pearson was Weldon's greatest ally, and this kind of thing drove him up a wall. Typical Mendelians. In our own day, meanwhile, the notion that one ought to come out of a biological curriculum without a determinist attitude has been reinforced over and over and over again. Our biology does not sanction genetic determinism, and yet our biology curriculum might reinforce it. I'll just give you a few examples. There is a project in New York, the Resilience Project, which encourages people to have their whole genome sequenced because they suspect that out there are people carrying in their genomes genes that the medical textbooks declare to be lethal. They ought to be dead already, but they're not. They're perfectly healthy. And that's, of course, because there are interactions in that genome, which we ought to want to know about. A quotation from a paper that's currently in press. While a mutation associated with hemochromatosis or breast cancer might have high expression in one particular pedigree or clan, that same mutation may have very low expression in another pedigree, clan, or group of unrelated people. Perhaps we should get rid of terms such as the expressivity and penetrance of genes altogether and just discuss the expression of each trait in the context of a phenotypic spectrum, which is, of course, what led Walter Frank Raphael Weldon to establish the field of biometry. Co-author on this paper is a fellow named Golson Lyon. He's a kind of a special case. I'll be coming back to him. Within our field, of course, we are long familiar with this message, most brilliantly articulated, I think, by Evelyn Fox Keller in her book, The Century of the Gene. That was published in 2000, so a century after the rediscovery of Mendel's work. She called the 20th century the century of the gene by way of saying it's over. The notion of a little atom of heredity marching through the generations with a stable identity, causing complex traits, just doesn't map onto what is known in the 21st century about how bodies actually work. She doesn't in her book, however, say what the new concepts in language ought to be. She just says that we need new ones. Finally, a colleague of mine at Leeds, Jenny Lewis, who works in education, in 2011 had this to say about the place of Mendelism in a curriculum where the world around it had changed quite a lot. When helping students to develop their understanding of basic genetic concepts, it can be useful to reduce complexity by adopting a traditional linear view of gene expression, one gene, one protein, one characteristic. But there is a risk that this will result in a deterministic view of genetics, in which every characteristic is determined by a single gene. So you stay simple and traditional on the view that you want students to feel comfortable at first, to gain a certain base, and then you complexify later. But that comes at a cost, said Jenny Lewis anyway. Well, I'm delighted to say that at Leeds, we were able to actually do this experiment. That's the Leeds HPS group some years ago. But there in the group, you'll see Annie Jamieson, who's here this evening. That's Annie more recently. And beginning in 2012, Annie and I worked in close collaboration together. Amazingly enough, we got a grant to do this, to develop, deliver, and assess a Weldonian curriculum in beginning genetics to see what effects it had, if any, on the students as compared with students who were taught the Mendelian curriculum. And I'm going to give you, not anything like as well as Annie did, the beginning and end of the very first lecture, just to give you a taste of what it was. But let me explain the experimental design. So this is a literal experiment. Not literally about the scientific past, but a literal experiment. We messed with the world. We messed with some students' minds. Here's how the experiment went. We recruited students to be our volunteers on our experimental curriculum. It was decided within the university that it would be inappropriate to use students who were themselves studying science because this could mess with their minds in the wrong ways. And so they declared that art students, however, were open game. And so we recruited from students going into their second year in arts. We had around 30 students in the end. We promised them an Amazon voucher if they sat through the course as a whole and took our battery of assessments. And in addition to developing the curriculum, Annie developed, from using resources that were already out there, genetic determinism questionnaires. And so at the beginning of our course and at the beginning of, let's call it Genetics 101 at Leeds, the students were given these genetic determinism questionnaires. And they filled them out at the beginning of the course, and then they filled them out at the end. So our control group were the students taking the ordinary biology course. Now, there are enormous incomparabilities between our control group and our experimental group. So at most, what I'm going to describe to you could be, it could be described as a pilot study. The students taking Genetics 101 had 3 lectures a week with 300 other students. They had labs. We were dealing with 30 students who took a boutique course with Annie once a week. Nevertheless, that was our setup. And Annie, in my view, did an absolutely brilliant job of channeling the spirit of Weldon. I said, Annie's been working with me on the manuscript, and I'm so delighted with the curriculum she's come up with. So again, I won't do this justice, but imagine you're there in the course, and it's the first day, and the first lecture is on the question, what is genetics? And I'm going to both give this to you and analyze it as we go. So we start with inheritance as we observe it, this marvelous picture. And just some basic observations about offspring and their parents, that humans have human babies, horses have foals, tigers have baby tigers, and that so there is a sameness that gets preserved, and yet there is difference as well, and different degrees of difference. So the baby tiger is much more like its parent than the baby horse seems to be like its parent. The children in the human family more closely resemble their parents than they will resemble the parents of their friends. And yet they're different from their parents, and they're different from each other. We want to know about all of that. We want to know both about the sameness that gets preserved over time and about the differences. Now immediately we start going off-piste. The next slide, the next bit of the lesson, is to do with inheritance and development. I've learned from Annie that in biological education, development is a different course. There's genetics and there's development. In our course, in a Weldonian spirit, right from the start, the students are taught to think about inheritance as fundamentally tied up with development. It isn't the case that a mature character is inherited. What are inherited are genes, and not just genes, cytoplasm, so forth. When we think about how genes affect bodies, we have to think all the time about the developmental context in which they function. Again, going pretty far away from the things students would get ordinarily. Third slide, organism and environment. Environments aren't just one thing. They're many things. Your family is an environment of a kind. The climate is the diet. She encouraged the students to ask themselves, what do they think of as their environment? What kinds of shapes does it have? How many are there? And then she does something I think absolutely lovely. She gives two cases. One in which the same genome with different environments produces very different results, and the other in which different genomes in the same environment give different results. So she starts with this one, same genome, different environments. Genes, environment, and the honeybee. Queen and workers are genetically identical. Larvae fed initially on royal jelly. So larvae are fed initially on royal jelly and then switch to pollen. They become the sterile workers. Whereas the larvae, which are fed exclusively on royal jelly, become the fertile queens. Contrast that with the case of genes, environment, and fat mice, the OB gene. So this is a gene that encodes a hormone called leptin, which regulates appetite and energy expenditure. So when you've got leptin working as it ought, your appetite is regulated and you metabolize better. When the mutation is present, that doesn't happen. So right from the start, students are presented with genes and environment as interactive and as symmetrical. It isn't the case that genes are super causes and everything else is kind of supplementary to them. Genes are there along with lots of other things. And so if we skip ahead to the very end of the first lesson, we come to the heart. Cardiovascular disease, and the question of the contribution that genes make. That's a representation of some of the contributing factors to cardiovascular illness. You'll see that genes are there, along with a number of other things. And Annie takes the students through the causal lines of influence. It isn't just that the genes affect cardiovascular disease directly, they affect other things. And she has dotted lines for where the connection is more conjectured than in other cases. And goes through, one by one, age, sex, alcohol, smoking, activity, obesity, diabetes, blood pressure. And then we get the whole thing. And she asked the students, is there a gene for cardiovascular disease? So that's lesson 1. 10 of those lessons. At the end of it, what did we find? So here's the big reveal. What we found is that students coming out of a traditional Mendelian course came out of it just as determinist about genes as they'd been at the start. Whereas students coming out of our course were significantly less so. Now, especially having done a lot of work recently on Mendel's data and the question of how he interpreted them, I don't want to make too big a deal about this. And as I say, there are incomparabilities all over the shop. So at most what we've got here are a suggestive set of results. But we actually did the experiment. We actually found out what happens when you try to develop a curriculum from the counterfactual history of science and teach it to students. What kind of cognitive effects does it have? We could well have found it made no difference whatsoever. But we don't think that we found that. So let me conclude. John Kenneth Galbraith said that you should use the phrase "to conclude" as often as you can because it gives your audiences hope. So I probably should have used it earlier, but now I genuinely am concluding. So first of all, science education. We are really excited about what we've done, and our hope is that in publishing our results, we can begin to link up with other people. Next week, I'm going to be presenting a shorter version of this at the meeting of the History, Philosophy, and Social Studies of Biology conference in a session on experimental genetics curricula. And one of the things I'm fascinated to learn is how people who haven't had a head full of Weldon, people who have, for independent reasons, become dissatisfied with the state of traditional genetics teaching, how their work seems to differ from what Annie and I have done. At least at the moment, it does seem as if the developmentalist emphasis in our curriculum is distinctive. But that's to be revisited. So my hope is that if this is able to develop and continue to be tested, and I will soon make Annie's materials available on our website, that this just might make a difference. And there's a weird way, in ways I've talked about with John Christie over the years, in which the counterfactual can become actual if studied too much. But I'm relaxed about that. Secondly, or I should say relatedly, what's fascinating to me in this case is the way in which it's not suggesting that students ought to learn something completely different from what they're being taught. It's rather about what is made central and what is made peripheral. And I struggle even to find a language in which to put this. But my hunch is that this matters and ought to be investigable. The question of cognitive organization and the effects that it has on how one organizes one's knowledge and how one then goes on to think about the world and to act upon it. My inspiration here comes from a work of counterfactualist history of science from Peter Bowler. Not so much the book as an article that Peter wrote before that in an ISIS special section on counterfactuals and the historian of science. And in that article, what Peter put in a way I'd never seen before was the notion that it's a mistake to suppose that when one's thinking counterfactually, you have to think of everything being the same or everything being totally different. There are many options, and it can matter for things in the counterfactual past to have the same elements but in a different relationship, to have come about in a different order. That can be important. Those can be differences that make a difference. And I think the curriculum that we've developed is an expression of that conviction, that the reordering can itself be consequential. My own view, and I've said this to Hasok Chang before, is that he needs to do this too. In Hasok's brilliant book on inventing temperature, published in 2004, he brought back to attention the way that boiling point used to be thought of as variable. Nowadays, of course, it's thought of as constant. You will see right away affinities with the story that I've been telling you about variability and constancy. And I've seen Hasok in to and fro with scientists who, when confronted with his story, will say, but we know about that. We know that boiling point is variable. And of course, in a way they do, and in a way they don't. And my own sense of it is that what is really driving Hasok's analysis is a question of what is central and what is peripheral. What you can forget as a matter of being a working chemist and what you can't forget because it's actually at the core of your identity. And so perhaps one way to extend this method, if it appeals, would be to develop a chemical curriculum in which boiling point was taught to be variable. And to make the whole of the curriculum sensitive in those kinds of ways, and then again to see what the students were like at the end compared with traditionally taught students. Many of you will know that in that book, Hasok, he finished the book with a manifesto for what he called HPS as complementary science. And I've loved this from the moment that I encountered it. The notion that the history and philosophy of science can be stimulating for scientists, that we shouldn't be in the lab with them, but we should be down the corridor, investigating all of the neglected phenomena, all of the marginalized critiques, keeping it all alive so that they can't, in a Kuhnian way, shut them down completely. The history of science is full of critical resource, and that we are the people to keep it alive. Now, although I've always loved it, I never quite thought of this project in that way. If I had to give it a name, I would call it Science is Complementary HPS. Because in teaching a Weldonian curriculum to students, in the first instance, what I want to know more about is the history of science. It's in this sense I see myself as experimenting with the scientific past. I want to know what might have been. That's principally what drives me. And so I think that one can try to do things in the present, reviving neglected research programs, seeing how far they go, pedagogically in my case, maybe non-pedagogically in other cases, but to do so for historians' reasons, for our explanatory purposes. Because if it isn't the case that a Weldonian curriculum was bound to be impossible, that a Weldonian biology was bound to fail, whether in some ways it seems to suit 21st century biology better than a Mendelian curriculum, then one has to look elsewhere in explaining why exactly Mendelism triumphed. And that's one project of my book. But as I say, I adore HPS as complementary science, and I've been pleased that some of this seems to be functioning in something like the way that Hasek outlined. This is Golson Lyon, whose paper I quoted from earlier. Through the magic of social media, Golson's found out about the work that Annie and I have been doing. He's based at Cold Spring Harbor. He is a clinical neurogeneticist. And in that article, which is to appear in a handbook, he begins with an epigraph, which is taken from Weldon. Weldon, 1902, the paper in which that photograph of peas appears. This is at the head of Golson's paper. The fundamental mistake which vitiates all work based upon Mendel's method is the neglect of ancestry and the attempt to regard the whole effect upon offspring produced by a particular parent as due to the existence in the parent of particular structural characters. That's the beginning. And he goes on at the end. Within the current paradigm of genetic determinism, which stretches back to the time of William Bateson, some people would have us believe that variants can and should be binned into different classes based on clinical utility and validity, without any obvious regard to genetic background or environmental differences. Environment and ancestry matter. Categorical thinking misses complexity. So through a bit of counterfactualist energy, a creative scientist in our own time has found an ally across the seas of time in W.F.R. Weldon in ways to be counterfactual that I don't think he otherwise would have. And that brings us to Mendel. You might be asking, as someone did in a talk I recently gave, poor Mendel, what kind of anniversary present is all of this for Mendel, to jettison him from his place in the textbooks? And I know where you're coming from, but I think that's getting it wrong. I think that it's one thing to esteem Gregor Mendel. It's something else to think that biology students today are best suited, best served by being given his work first in a curriculum. They deserve a curriculum which is fit for purpose. And Mendel deserves to be read. And I'm delighted to say that the British Society for the History of Science in the latter part of this year will be publishing a new translation of Mendel's Experiments in Plant Hybridization. It was done by Stefan Müller-Wiehle and Kirsten Hall, and we're going to be publishing it in a freely accessible form in this remarkable work that they've done, where not only do we have side by side the original text and their new translation, but you can click on almost any sentence and be given the critical apparatus. It's an extraordinary work. And to really celebrate Mendel, who absolutely deserves celebration and deserves to be read, is to read him well and to read him historically, to read him sensitive to the ways in which he was part of his own time. I think we ought to let Mendel be part of his time and let our biology students be part of their time. Those are two different conversations which have got entangled. And so finally to Swansea. Swansea and the BSHS, that other meeting in 1880 that Ewan Morris mentioned in his opening plenary. I take this from Louise Mescal's work. I don't know if she's here. She's based here at Swansea University, a lovely book about the meeting places for Victorian scientists. And so she has this picture of the opening ceremony. I don't think it went down in the annals of the BSHS as one of their greatest meetings. It was a little under-attended. The weather wasn't brilliant, unlike for our meeting. But this was where Weldon, as a student at Cambridge, first came across Francis Galton. He was, of course, familiar with Galton, as everyone was, as the author of The Art of Travel. But it was at the BSHS here in Swansea that he got to see Galton in action for the first time. And he remembered that enough that he wrote about it later. Galton was everywhere at the Swansea meeting. He was an immensely creative scientific man, and he was talking about his new mathematical instruments. He was reporting on a committee, the work of a committee which had overseen anthropometric data surveys. And he gave an evening discourse, in the course of which he talked about his then new technique of composite portraiture, a technique whereby you took pictures of individuals and merged them in order to see what kind of a type lay behind them. And apparently there was much mirth here in Swansea in 1880 when Galton did this experiment for them using the images of Welsh divines. What is the type of the Welsh divine? Oh, he performed for them. I can't myself find those pictures, but I thought it was a great experiment. So this is my final experiment with the scientific past. I thought I'd try the same thing, but I do it with Welsh historians of science. I started with Ewan Morris, out and proud as a Welsh historian of science, not beginning with his opening plenary the other day. I mixed in a little bit of Jeff Hughes, part of the Welsh diaspora, which has been so stimulating beyond these borders. And I added in Adam Mosley, our host. 11 years in Swansea. I think Adam counts now. He ought to count. But I fear something might be wrong with my technique, because this is what on that note, thank you very much.
I personally, when you said you were about to conclude, I felt very sad. So I'm sorry for that. We've got some time for questions. Would anybody like to ask a question? Sally.
Did your experiment have to be counterfactual?
Say that one minute, I'm sorry?
Did your experiment have to be counterfactual, given that we're now in the era of epigenetics?
This is a question I ask myself, and my meetings next week with Rosie Redfield and others will help me get at that. So, did you really need a historian of science to do this? And quite deliberately, there's no history of science in the curriculum. In that respect, it's quite unlike what typically happens when historians of science and science educators get together. And in principle, it doesn't seem as if one really needed to come at this from a Weldonian perspective. In practice, it appears that you did, in that there are other people who've looked at the present-day curriculum, been dissatisfied, found it out of date in all kinds of ways, and yet when they went back to the drawing board, they didn't come up with what Annie and I have come up with. And so it does seem as if it vindicates the notion, and HPS's complementary science notion, that within the scientific past, there are perspectives which are hard to reinvent. The great thing about Weldon is that he was thoughtful about Mendelism before Mendelism had taken over. Once Mendelism has taken over, it turns out, it seems to me, to become very hard to unthink. With Weldon, you have a creative, critical scientific mind who really gets Mendelism, in some ways gets it much more so than its advocates. And it does seem as if it is hard to invent off one's own bat. The genuinely independent-mindedness. And so that, to that extent, it does seem as though the counterfactualist element matters. What would the curriculum look like if Weldon had developed it, or if it had developed out of a Weldonian success?
Yeah, you first.
Yes, you may remember the conversation about the factual, counterfactual papers. I was rather acid, I think, about it. I thank you for putting my mind at Hubbard. It was a lovely place.
Oh, thank you.
Much indeed. Thank you.
Oh, all right, okay. Thank you. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but thank you very much. Good.
There was a whole flurry of hands just then. You're the first one that caught my eye.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for that, Greg. That was really thought-provoking. What would you say to the criticism, though, that counterfactualism is really just wishful thinking? And I couldn't help but think that maybe you would hope Weldon had actually won this battle between Mendel and maybe not died so young.
It's a good question. My colleague at Leeds, Stephen French, has called this modal romanticism. Things would have been better had it gone differently in the past. And I guess I have mixed feelings about this. I don't quite know. Well, there are a number of things to say. One is that counterfactual thoughts don't have to, and as a matter of fact, don't always take that form. One could also think ingratitude, if not for that accident in the past, I wouldn't have this brilliant present. That's just as much a counterfactual thought. It's the kind of thing that we all have, if I hadn't caught that bus, etc. And so anthropologically, whether nostalgic historians, nostalgic for a past that never was, are drawn to this any more than any other, I don't know, but I guess, again, I'm inclined to say whatever the psychic motives behind people wanting to do this more than others, deal with the arguments. Yeah.
One more question.
I wondered if you're being Mendelian about history and assuming that either Mendel won or he didn't.
Yes.
But in fact, we have a biology which incorporates Mendelianism and elements of Weldon.
Yeah.
So the problem with counterfactuals is that they inaccurately assume that failed theories have nothing to do with present theories.
You think you've mixed. I appreciate the question. I think the latter part of it I didn't quite understand, and maybe we can come back to. But the first part, I'm glad that you touched on, because in a more developed form, what I would like to say is that, and I've learned a lot about this from Annie, and here my thoughts of center periphery I think are helpful. It's not the case that the Weldonian perspective disappeared. And again, I hope that parts of my talk suggested that that what I was interested in doing is taking something which has been around, but somehow cognitively not central. And so one can say, of course, as any genetics teacher would say, of course I don't think genes determine bodies and minds as such. Of course, it's all environmentally conditioned in all kinds of ways. And yet, when they stride into the classroom, out comes a way of teaching in which all of that gets marginalized. And so, so I say in a more developed form, I would bring out the ways in which a Weldonian present is the more plausible because Weldonian kinds of thinking remained part of the biological mainstream, and yet not central to it. So I both agree with you, and think though that ultimately that helps my case, in that I think it makes my counterfactual more plausible than one in which there really is very little contact with present-day biology.
I'm afraid it's 7:30. I think after that tour de force, we should give you a break. Don't all disappear after I thank Greg, because I have instructions that Adam wants to talk to you. But I'd like very much to thank Greg, and I was sort of fantasizing while you were talking about the next meeting in Swansea in perhaps 100 years' time, when someone delivers a counterfactual lecture about how the history of science would have been different if Greg Radick hadn't given it. But I was listening to you at the same time. So thank you very, very much indeed. That was absolutely fabulous talk. Really thought-provoking and stimulating.